The morning sun cast long shadows across the Veterans Memorial Ceremony as dozens of uniformed servicemen and women gathered to honor their fallen brothers. Among them stood Robert "Bobby" Martinez, a weathered man in his 70s whose silver hair caught the light beneath his worn baseball cap. His navy blue jacket displayed an array of military patches, each one telling a story of service and sacrifice. Bobby had been coming to these ceremonies for 15 years, ever since retiring from his job at the local hardware store. He never spoke much during these gatherings, preferring to stand quietly in the back, his weathered hands clasped behind him as speakers shared memories of those who never made it home. Today felt different, though. A local news crew had arrived, and a young reporter was interviewing veterans about their service. When the camera turned toward Bobby, he shifted uncomfortably. The reporter, a blonde woman in her 20s named Sarah Collins, approached with her microphone extended. "Sir, could you tell us about your military service?" she asked with a practiced smile. Bobby cleared his throat, his voice raspy from decades of cigarettes he'd quit 10 years too late. "Served in Vietnam," he said simply. "Did my job, came home." "What unit were you with?" Sarah pressed, sensing there might be more to the story. "Special Operations," Bobby replied, his eyes distant. "Did some things I don't talk much about. Lost some good friends over there." The reporter's eyes lit up. In her enthusiasm for a compelling story, she began asking more detailed questions. Bobby answered reluctantly, mentioning classified missions and operations that few people knew about. He spoke of jungle warfare, rescue operations, and the brotherhood forged in the hellish conditions of Southeast Asia. What Bobby didn't realize was that Marcus Wheeler, a local military historian and self-appointed guardian against stolen valor, was standing just close enough to overhear the conversation. Wheeler, a man who had never served himself, but had made it his mission to expose fake veterans, immediately grew suspicious. He'd heard similar stories before from men seeking attention or sympathy they hadn't earned. Wheeler pulled out his smartphone and began recording as Bobby continued talking. The old man's account seemed too detailed, too dramatic. He mentioned specific unit designations and operations that Wheeler couldn't immediately verify. In Wheeler's experience, real special operations veterans rarely talked so openly about their service, especially not to reporters at public events. After the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Wheeler approached Bobby directly. "Excuse me," he said, his tone confrontational. "I couldn't help but overhear your interview. You mentioned being in special operations in Vietnam. What unit specifically?" Bobby looked at the younger man with tired eyes. "Like I told the reporter, special ops. That's all you need to know." "Really?" Wheeler's voice grew louder, drawing attention from other veterans nearby. "Because I've studied military history extensively and your story doesn't add up. Real Navy SEALs don't usually broadcast their service like that." "I never said I was a SEAL," Bobby replied quietly. But Wheeler wasn't listening. "The timeline doesn't work," Wheeler continued, now speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The operations you described, the locations you mentioned, I think you're lying about your service, old man." A crowd began to gather as Wheeler's accusations grew more heated. He accused Bobby of stolen valor, of dishonoring real veterans who had actually served. Bobby stood silently, his jaw clenched, as the younger man berated him in front of people who had become his friends over the years. Someone in the crowd called the police, claiming there was a disturbance. Within minutes, 2 patrol officers arrived on the scene. Officer Janet Rodriguez, a 10-year veteran of the force, and her partner, Officer Mike Chen, stepped between Bobby and Wheeler, trying to calm the situation. "What's the problem here?" Rodriguez asked, looking between the 2 men. Wheeler immediately launched into his accusations, claiming Bobby was committing stolen valor by lying about military service. He showed the officers the video he'd recorded, pointing out what he considered inconsistencies in Bobby's story. The gathered crowd was divided, some supporting Wheeler's call for accountability, others defending Bobby as a regular at their ceremonies. Bobby remained largely silent throughout Wheeler's tirade, occasionally shaking his head but not defending himself aggressively. When Officer Rodriguez asked for his identification and military records, Bobby calmly explained that he didn't carry his DD-214 discharge papers with him to memorial services. "I can get them if you need them," Bobby said quietly. "They're at home in my safe." But Wheeler wasn't satisfied. "This man is disrespecting every veteran here," he declared. "He's stolen valor, and there should be consequences." The situation escalated when Wheeler demanded the officers arrest Bobby immediately. While stolen valor is indeed a federal crime when used for personal gain, the officers weren't entirely sure how to proceed. Bobby hadn't been asking for money, free meals, or any tangible benefits. He'd simply answered questions from a reporter. However, the pressure from the crowd and Wheeler's insistence that Bobby was committing a crime put the officers in a difficult position. They decided to take Bobby to the station for questioning, hoping to sort out the truth once they could properly verify his military records. As Officer Rodriguez placed handcuffs on Bobby's wrists, the old man finally spoke up. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice steady despite the humiliation. "Call the Navy. They'll tell you who I was." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Bobby was led to the patrol car. Some veterans who knew him from years of ceremonies tried to vouch for his character, but the officers explained they needed to follow procedure. As the car pulled away from the memorial, Bobby stared out the window at the faces of people who had respected him just an hour earlier. At the police station, Bobby was processed and placed in a holding cell while officers began the lengthy process of verifying military records. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was spending what might be his last Memorial Day in jail, accused of dishonoring the very service that had defined so much of his adult life. The fluorescent lights in the police station interrogation room cast harsh shadows across Bobby's weathered face as Detective Lisa Hammond reviewed the case file. Hammond, a 15-year veteran of the police force and daughter of a Korean War veteran, took stolen valor cases seriously. She understood the deep hurt it caused real veterans when someone falsely claimed their sacrifices. Bobby sat quietly across from her, his hands folded on the metal table. He had declined a lawyer, insisting that the truth would speak for itself once they properly investigated his background. Detective Hammond found his calm demeanor either the mark of an innocent man or an experienced con artist. "Mr. Martinez," Hammond began, opening her notepad, "we need to go through your story step by step. You claim to have served in Vietnam in special operations. Can you provide specific details about your service?" Bobby nodded slowly. "Enlisted in 1968, straight out of high school. Basic training at Great Lakes Naval Training Center. Then specialized training that I'm still not supposed to talk about in detail." Hammond made notes as he spoke. The basic information seemed consistent with military procedures of that era. "You mentioned specialized training. What kind of specialized training?" "Underwater demolition, small boat operations, reconnaissance," Bobby replied. "Worked with different units depending on what was needed. Sometimes Army Special Forces, sometimes Marine Recon, sometimes just U.S. Navy guys." This was where Hammond's suspicions began to grow. Bobby's description of his service seemed to span multiple branches and specialties in a way that didn't match her understanding of military organization. Real special operations veterans she'd encountered typically had very specific unit assignments and rarely worked across different service branches. "Can you be more specific about your unit designation?" she pressed. Bobby was quiet for a long moment. "Ma'am, with respect, some of that information is still classified. What I can tell you is that I served with UDT-12 initially, then got transferred to other operations that didn't have regular unit names." Hammond made note of UDT-12, Underwater Demolition Team 12. She would need to verify whether that unit existed during Bobby's claimed service period. The problem was that military records from the Vietnam era were notoriously difficult to access, especially for special operations units that operated under various levels of secrecy. While Bobby waited in the holding cell, Hammond began the arduous process of verification. She contacted the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, but was told that accessing detailed records for classified operations could take weeks or months. The staff member she spoke with mentioned that many records from that era had been damaged in a fire in 1973, making verification even more challenging. Meanwhile, word of Bobby's arrest had spread throughout the local veteran community. The story had taken on a life of its own, with social media posts calling Bobby either a hero wrongly accused or a fraud finally exposed. Marcus Wheeler had posted the video of his confrontation with Bobby online, where it quickly garnered hundreds of views and heated comments from both sides. Some veterans who knew Bobby personally began coming forward to defend him. Frank Sullivan, a Marine who had served 2 tours in Vietnam, visited the police station to vouch for Bobby's character. "I've known Bobby for 12 years, Sullivan told Detective Hammond. "We've shared stories, talked about things only guys who were there would understand. He's never asked for anything, never tried to get free meals or special treatment. If he says he served, I believe him." But character witnesses weren't enough to resolve the legal question. Hammond needed concrete evidence of Bobby's military service to dismiss the stolen valor charges that Wheeler was demanding. The detective's investigation hit another snag when she tried to contact former members of UDT-12. Military historians confirmed that the unit had existed during the Vietnam War, but finding living members who could verify Bobby's service proved nearly impossible. Many records from underwater demolition teams were classified, and those that weren't were often incomplete. Dr. James Morrison, a military historian at the local university, provided some helpful context when Hammond consulted with him. The nature of special operations during Vietnam was quite different from today, he explained. Units were often formed for specific missions and then dissolved. Personnel were frequently transferred between different operations based on their skills rather than traditional unit structures. This information supported Bobby's claim about working with different units, but it also made verification more complex. Morrison cautioned that the fluid nature of special operations during that era meant that traditional military records might not tell the complete story. As the hours turned into a full day, Bobby remained in custody while Hammond continued her investigation. The local news station had picked up the story, running a segment about the arrest of a man claiming to be a Vietnam veteran. The coverage was sensational, focusing more on the drama of the accusation than on the complex reality of verifying decades-old military service. Bobby's neighbor, Maria Santos, watched the news with growing distress. She had known Bobby for 8 years, ever since moving in next door to his small ranch house. He had helped her with yard work, fixed her fence after a storm, and never once mentioned his military service until she noticed him leaving for Memorial Day ceremonies. Maria decided to visit Bobby's house, where she knew he kept important documents in a safe. Bobby had given her the combination years earlier in case of emergency, trusting her to look after his affairs if anything happened to him. Inside the safe, she found what she was looking for: Bobby's DD-214 discharge papers, along with several commendations and a faded photograph of young men in military uniforms. When Maria brought the documents to the police station, Detective Hammond finally had official military records to examine. The DD-214 confirmed Bobby's basic service information, but the details were frustratingly vague. His military occupational specialty was listed with a code that Hammond couldn't immediately decipher, and several sections were marked as classified. "These papers look authentic," Hammond told Bobby when she showed him the documents. "But the classification markings mean I can't verify the specific operations you described." Bobby nodded. That's the way it was designed, Detective. Some things we did weren't supposed to exist on paper. The photograph Maria had found showed a young Bobby with several other servicemen, standing on what appeared to be a dock with military vessels in the background. On Bobby's forearm, clearly visible in the black and white image, was a tattoo that matched the one Detective Hammond could see on the elderly man sitting across from her. The tattoo was distinctive, an anchor surrounded by water, and what appeared to be specialized military symbols. Hammond had seen military tattoos before, but this one was particularly intricate and specific. It looked like the kind of tattoo that marked membership in an elite unit, not something a civilian would randomly choose. Despite the mounting evidence supporting Bobby's service, Detective Hammond remained cautious. The pressure from Marcus Wheeler and the public attention on the case meant that she needed ironclad proof before releasing Bobby and dismissing the charges. As the second day of Bobby's detention began, Hammond made one more call, this time to the Pentagon's office that handled special operations records. She explained the situation and was transferred to a specialist who dealt with classified personnel files from the Vietnam era. The conversation was frustratingly bureaucratic. Yes, records existed for the operations Bobby described. No, they couldn't be released without proper authorization. Yes, the process for getting that authorization could take months. No, there wasn't a faster way to verify his service for law enforcement purposes. Bobby spent another night in the county jail, sleeping fitfully on a narrow cot while his case grew more complicated by the hour. The third morning of Bobby's detention brought an unexpected visitor to the police station. Vice Admiral Richard Dick Thornton, a distinguished naval officer who happened to be in town for a Navy recruiting event, had seen the news coverage of the stolen valor case. Something about the story bothered him enough to make an unscheduled stop at the police station. Detective Hammond was surprised when the desk sergeant informed her that a high-ranking naval officer was requesting to speak with her about the Martinez case. Vice Admiral Thornton, dressed in his service dress blue uniform with rows of ribbons spanning his chest, carried himself with the bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades in the Navy. "Detective Hammond," Thornton said as he entered her office, "I understand you're investigating a case involving alleged stolen valor. I'd like to speak with the suspect if possible." Hammond was puzzled but cooperative. Having a vice admiral take personal interest in a local stolen valor case was highly unusual. "May I ask why you're interested in this particular case?" "Sir?" Thornton's expression was serious as he explained. "The news report mentioned that the suspect claimed service with underwater demolition teams in Vietnam. I commanded UDT operations in the Pacific during that period. If this man is lying about serving with my units, I want to know. If he's telling the truth and being wrongly accused, that concerns me even more." Within minutes, Hammond was escorting the vice admiral to the holding area where Bobby had spent the last 3 days. When the cell door opened and Bobby looked up to see a Navy vice admiral standing in the corridor, his eyes widened in genuine surprise. "Son, I'm Vice Admiral Thornton," the officer said, studying Bobby's face carefully. "I understand you claim to have served with UDT in Vietnam." Bobby stood up slowly, his civilian clothes wrinkled from days in custody. "Yes, sir. UDT 12 initially, then other operations." Thornton nodded and stepped closer to the cell. "What years?" 1968 to 1972, sir. Did 2 tours." The vice admiral's trained eye was taking in every detail of Bobby's appearance and demeanor. The way Bobby stood when addressing a superior officer, the automatic "sir" in his responses, the recognition in his eyes when he saw Thornton's ribbons. These were subtle indicators that spoke to military training. "Roll up your sleeves," Thornton said suddenly. Bobby complied, pushing up the sleeves of his shirt to reveal his forearms. On his right arm was the distinctive tattoo that Detective Hammond had noticed in the old photograph, an anchor surrounded by water with specialized symbols that looked like military insignia. Vice Admiral Thornton's demeanor changed immediately. He stepped closer to the cell bars, studying the tattoo with intense focus. After a long moment, he turned to Detective Hammond with a grave expression. "Detective, this man needs to be released immediately." Hammond was taken aback. "Sir, I appreciate your interest, but I still haven't been able to verify his specific service records." Thornton pointed to Bobby's tattoo. "You see that symbol there, next to the anchor? That's the insignia for Special Operations Group Maritime Unit 7. I know because I helped design it in 1969. That tattoo wasn't something you could just walk into a parlor and get done. It was earned." Bobby's eyes filled with tears as recognition dawned on the Vice Admiral's face. "You were SMU 7, Thornton said softly. "We called you guys the Ghost Swimmers." The Vice Admiral explained to Detective Hammond that SMU 7 was one of the most classified units operating in Vietnam. They conducted reconnaissance missions along the coast, planted underwater explosives on enemy supply lines, and performed rescues in areas where conventional forces couldn't operate. "The reason you can't find records," Thornton told Hammond, "is because officially SMU 7 never existed. It was a Black Ops unit that reported directly to Naval Special Warfare Command. Even I didn't know all the details of what they did." Bobby was released from custody within an hour. As he walked out of the police station with Vice Admiral Thornton beside him, a small crowd of supporters and curious onlookers had gathered outside. Marcus Wheeler was notably absent. Having deleted his social media posts after learning that a Vice Admiral had vouched for Bobby's service. The local news station that had originally covered Bobby's arrest now found themselves with an even more compelling story: the vindication of a decorated veteran who had been wrongly accused. Reporter Sarah Collins, whose questions at the memorial service had inadvertently started the whole ordeal, requested an interview with both Bobby and the Vice Admiral. "I don't need to be on TV," Bobby said quietly when asked about the interview. "I just want to go home." But Vice Admiral Thornton had other ideas. "Actually, Bobby, I think your story needs to be told. Not for glory, but so people understand that not all military service fits into neat categories that civilians can easily verify." In the interview that aired that evening, Thornton explained the complex reality of special operations during the Vietnam War. Many veterans, he said, had served with distinction in units that were deliberately kept secret. Their service was no less valuable because it couldn't be easily verified through normal channels. Bobby spoke briefly about the ordeal, expressing no bitterness toward those who had doubted him. "They were trying to protect the honor of military service," he said. "I can't fault them for that, even though they got it wrong this time." The story had a profound impact on the local veteran community. Frank Sullivan, the Marine who had vouched for Bobby's character, organized a formal apology ceremony at the same memorial where the original confrontation had occurred. Dozens of veterans attended to show their support for Bobby and to acknowledge the mistake that had been made. Marcus Wheeler eventually reached out to Bobby personally to apologize. In a private conversation, Wheeler explained that his crusade against stolen valor came from seeing his own father's service dishonored by men who had never worn a uniform. Bobby accepted the apology graciously, understanding that Wheeler's intentions had been honorable, even if his methods were flawed. Detective Hammond learned valuable lessons from the case as well. She implemented new procedures for investigating stolen valor claims, including consultation with military historians and retired officers who could provide context that official records might not contain. Vice Admiral Thornton stayed in touch with Bobby after the incident. During one of their conversations, he revealed that Bobby's unit had been responsible for several successful missions that had saved American lives, though the details remained classified. "Your service mattered more than you probably know," Thornton told him. 6 months after his arrest, Bobby returned to the Memorial Day ceremony at the same Veterans Memorial where his ordeal had begun. This time, however, he was approached not by accusers, but by fellow veterans who wanted to thank him for his service. The local VFW post had invited him to become a member, and the American Legion asked him to speak at their next meeting. Bobby still preferred to stand quietly in the back during ceremonies, but now he understood that his service, secret though it had been, was valued by those who mattered most, his fellow veterans. The tattoo on his arm, which had nearly been his downfall, had ultimately proven to be the key to vindicating his honor. When reporters asked Bobby what he had learned from the experience, his answer was simple. Sometimes the truth takes time to surface, but it usually does if good people are willing to look for it. The case became a cautionary tale about the importance of thorough investigation before making accusations of stolen valor. While protecting the honor of military service remained important, Bobby's experience showed that the reality of military service, especially during wartime, could be far more complex than civilian investigators might realize. Bobby Martinez returned to his quiet life, attending memorial services and helping his neighbors, secure in the knowledge that when his service was questioned, the truth had ultimately prevailed. His story served as a reminder that heroes don't always come with easily verified credentials, and that sometimes the most classified service is also the most heroic.